What's up everyone? In this video, we're going to cover how to swap in custom React components in Payload CMS fields. Before we get started though, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I release a video about Payload CMS, nextjs, and more. If you'd like to see the code that I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. There are 4 types of custom components: root, collection, global, and field custom components. My previous 2 videos covered root, collection, and global custom components. This video will build on concepts from those previous videos, so if you haven't watched those videos yet and are unfamiliar with custom components, please pause this one and go back and watch those videos. They highlight how to replace components in your admin UI, as well as the list view of your collections, and briefly, the edit views of both collections and globals. The video on root components also goes over what custom components are and how they work in detail. If there's a concept that I mention in this video that you're not familiar with, chances are high it's in the previous 2 videos. So now let's tackle replacing field components with our own custom React components. There are 3 places that you're able to replace a field's component. The first is in the edit view of a collection or global. This is the view you use to make changes to your content and can be used to change things like row labels and add descriptions using client props. The second is in the list view of collections. This allows you to change how a field is rendered in its cell of the list view table, or how the filter field renders and behaves. Since the filter component requires us to completely remake the look and functionality of the field, we won't cover that here. The last place is only included if you have versioning enabled, and that's the version diff view. This is the view that shows what is changed from version to version and is accessed in the edit view of a version enabled document. The diff component is only replaceable as of version 3.20. As I'm recording, I'm on payload version 3.18, which means that I don't have the ability to swap out the diff components on this video. All field components get their field config through props. We'll do some practical examples in a few moments, but for a quick example, you can import type text field server component from payload in order to access the text field props in a server component. All fields that accept components will take those components in the admin property under components. We'll go through each available option in turn, but each component will be imported in the same way we did it for root, collection, and global custom components. There are several default props that are available to you when replacing custom components in fields. Data returns the current document being edited. This gives you access to all the data in the document regardless of where it falls in the hierarchy. If you only want the data of the directly adjoining fields within a group, array, or some other named presentational field, you can use sibling data to return data only from there. Similarly, you can return the rendered value of the field using the value property. Doc preferences is an object that contains the preferences for the document. All preferences are stored for individual users, so this allows you to get and set individual user preferences at the field level. The field object returns the field config for your component. A sanitized version is returned for client components so you don't run into any errors. Server components also receive that sanitized version of the field config, which you can get by using the client field argument. This allows you to restrict the data you want to work with to only include data that can be worked within both client and server components. You can use validate to add your own custom validation to a field. If you want to make sure a text field is in the format of a phone number, you could do that by using a custom validate function to handle that check. User and permissions can be used to get the currently authenticated user and check their level of permissions to access certain data. So if you need to restrict some data that's being returned to only be viewed by certain authenticated users, you can do that using these options. You also have access to the internationalization, locale, and payload objects. Internationalization and locale will help you retrieve and process data according to the desired language, while the payload object gives you access to the local API so you can query documents within the custom component. Path, schema path, and index path can be used to retrieve a string representation of the path it takes to get to a certain field. Path returns the direct dynamic path to the field at runtime, meaning this value can change. Schema path is static, so it doesn't change, and it returns the path to the specific field's config. Lastly, a read-only option is available, which simply returns a Boolean value stating that the field is read-only or not. There are 9 customizable options available to you in field custom components. The field custom component option replaces the entire field. That means it falls on you to make sure you send and receive the value from the form. Fortunately, that's fairly easy to do by importing the use field hook to manage the field's value. This is not something that I plan on doing in a project, but so you can see a working example, I'll replace one of my post collection fields. Let's create a new directory for our field custom components in our components admin directory. We'll call this new directory fields. In the fields folder, we'll add a new TypeScript file called custom text field. Since we plan on retrieving data that's only available when the client is rendered, we're going to use the use client directive at the top of our file. We'll also import text field client component from payload to help us with the type safety in this component. With this custom field and many of the other components we'll be replacing, we'll need to install payload's UI package. So let's do that now by running pnpm add at payload CMS/UI and restart our server by running pnpm dev. We'll then go to our package.json file and make sure that our payload CMS/UI package installed correctly, and now we should be good to go. We'll run our development server again by running pnpm dev. Now back in our custom text field, we're going to import use field from payload CMS UI. Now we can export a const called custom text field and assign it the text field client component type and set that equal to our props and open an arrow function. We're going to destructure the use field hook by using const value and set value. And within the use field hook, we're going to pass in our path, which can be found at props.path. The first property here, value, is used to read the current value of the field, while set value is the function used to set the new value of the field, assuming value is updated. Whenever we call the use field hook, we need to provide a path to the field we want to replace. In this case, we're using a dynamic value from props path to take the path of wherever we import this component. That'll make more sense here in a moment. We can then return an input to replace the text input we're working on. Just so we can see what happens when we do this, we're going to set a style attribute and set the background to red. We then need to handle the data by setting onChange equal to an arrow function that takes e as an argument and use that arrow function pointing to set value e target value. This function manages the field's new value if it's updated. We then also need to include the value attribute, and we can set that equal to value. We'll see a type error if we just use value though. So since this is a text field and should only expect a string, we'll cast the value as string to ensure we don't see any more errors. To make sure we hit all the best practices for form fields, let's also add the ID field slug to our input. Then wrap the input in a div so we can include a label, which has the HTML4 attribute also set equal to field slug and the label set to slug. Once we do this, we can go to our post config and replace our slug text field. We'll add the admin option, then components, and then we're going to replace field and then provide a path to our component, which is going to be source components admin fields custom text field.tsx, and the export name is going to be custom text field. We'll then, just in case we need it, run payload generate import map and then pnpm dev. We can now go to our post collection and see that our slug field has been replaced with a system input field with a red background. Regardless of how easy it is to get the data to write correctly, it doesn't always make sense to replace an entire field. As you can see, the styles have been removed, and the label of the field would also have been removed if we didn't manually add it back in. So unless you have custom logic or predefined styles that you want or need to use with a specific field, I would encourage you to leave the default field as it is and edit other components using all the other options you have available. The label component is rendered anywhere a field needs a label. Typically, this is only in the edit view, but it can be used in your other views as well. I'll show you 2 examples here, changing a label in general and then replacing the default row labels with field data. First, let's change a label. We'll create a new tsx file in our admin fields directory, and we'll call it label.tsx. And at the top of this file, we'll import type text field label client component. And we're going to do this from payload. We'll use this to change the label of a text field. Export a const called custom text label and assign it the text field label client component. And then we're going to set it equal to an arrow function and return a div with a paragraph tag in it. This paragraph tag will say custom title label. Let's hop over back to our post config, find our title field, and add the admin option and components. And we're going to add label with the path source components admin fields label.tsx and the export name custom text label. We'll then run payload generate import map and then restart our development server. And once this loads up, we can now see that our title field has this custom title label. As you can see, this looks similar to how you can set your own label on the field. However, you are able to use full React components with dynamic capabilities here instead of just a string value like we did. Another use for labels is to dynamically replace the labels you get from array fields. Let's create an array field in our post config to see what the default behavior looks like. At the top of our fields here, we'll include a new field with the name of list type array and a fields array that contains a single field with the type of text and the name of list item. We can then also include some labels for both the singular, which we will call list item, and the plural, which will be list items. When we load up our development server, we now see our list array show up, and when we click add list item, a new item appears with a generic row label. As it is right now, we can't do anything manually to change that, so let's do it with a custom component. In our label.tsx file, we're going to add useClient at the top of the file, and we're going to import our use row label hook from Payload CMS UI. We can then export a const called custom row label and set that equal to an arrow function. And we're going to destructure our data and row number out of that use row label hook, pulling out list item, which is optional, but regardless will be the string type. We'll then use the label const and set that equal to data list item. Or if that doesn't exist, we can do list item and return a 2-digit number by using string, using the row number, making sure it's a non-null value, plus 1 since it's 0 indexed, and then pad the start of it by 2 using the number 0 as a string. We'll then return our div with the label in it. Now we can save this and go back to our post config, and underneath our type array, we'll add our admin property, and in that our component option, and we'll use our row label there, which of course takes a path, which is going to be source components admin fields label.tsx custom row label. We can then run payload generate import map, restart our development server running pnpm dev, refresh our post collection, and now when we add a list item, we can add something like YouTube, and then below that we can add Twitch. And so now we can see that the list item label updates along with whatever is in our list item field here. And if I delete this, we see list item 02, which indicates that this is the second row in our array. The description component takes precedence over the text description you're able to provide to each field. The description property is still important, so you can provide helpful hints in your IDE through the JS stocks that are created with the field. However, the description component comes in handy if you want to give your editors more information than text alone can tell someone. A good example of this is creating a client component that tells the user how many characters they have left to write. So let's do that now. First, let's add a max length to our title field. So we'll find our title field, and we're going to give it the max length of 60 characters. A title doesn't need to be very long, so 60 characters should be the perfect amount. Next, in our admin fields, we're going to create a new TypeScript file called description.tsx, and at the top of the file, we're going to use client, and we're going to import from payload our text field client props. Lastly, we'll import the use field hook from Payload CMS UI. Next, we'll create a new type called props, and we're going to set it equal to default length, which will take number, and join that with the text field client props we just imported from payload. We'll export a new const called title description and pass in props, and then open an arrow function. We'll destructure our props using the const path field and default length, and this will allow us to use just what we need from our props. We'll take the value from our field by setting a new const value and set that equal to use field. And just like we did before, we'll use path and use props.path to indicate which field we're getting the value from. This allows us to reuse this component if we want to use it on another field. It also ensures we won't break it if we change the field name for any reason. Next, we'll set a const called max length, and it's going to be set equal to the field's max length, or the default length that we will define here in a minute. Lastly, we're going to define const text, which is going to be our value as string. We can then return a div that's going to include the max length minus our text.length of max length characters left. Now, before we spin anything up, we're going to go back to our post config, and in our components here, we're going to add our description. Here, the description is still going to have a path, which is going to be source components, admin fields, description.tsx, and the title description export path. We're also going to include client props, where we can include our default length of something like 60 characters. Now we can run payload generate import map, restart our development server. Now once we scroll down, we can see that we have 49 of 60 characters left of our title field, and as I type, we can see that number count down. If I remove everything, I can see that there are 60 characters left. Now, what if before our author array, we wanted to include a user icon, just to give a nice additional touch to the field? We can use before input to do just that. So we'll grab a user icon from Lucid's icon library and copy the SVG. Then we'll go to our components, admin fields, and we're going to add a new TypeScript file, which we'll call authors.tsx. We'll then export a const called authors and set that equal to an arrow function. We'll then return a div that just has the SVG that we copied from Lucid's library. Now we can go back to our post config. We'll find our authors field and add in our admin option our components prop here, which is going to take before input, which takes an array of objects, which take paths, which we're going to have our source, components, admin, fields, authors.tsx, with the export name being authors. So now we can generate import map, run pnpm dev, and once our development server starts again, we can find our authors field, and we can see that the icon shows up above the field, which doesn't look great. The icon is technically before the input, but we want it to be on the same line to make it feel more streamlined. To do this, we need to add a class name to the SVG's div and add another class name to the relationship field itself. First, let's add a class name property to the admin option here and call it authors. So we can include class name and just use authors here. Then we'll go to our authors.tsx and in our div add another class name, which is going to have our author container class name. We can then go to our payload directory and open our custom.scss. And underneath these, we can add our authors div, which is going to have a display of flex and a gap of 1 rem. And then we can also use our author container, which is going to align items center. Now we can save this. And when everything refreshes, we see now that the user icon is before the input, just like we wanted it. We could also try putting this after the input by just switching before input to after input. And now when I save that and it refreshes, we can see that the user icon is added to the end of the field instead. I like it before, so we'll leave it as before input. We can also swap in our own error component when a field fails to validate. A great example of when to do this is for an email address that doesn't match the default format of an email address. We can replace the default error by going to our components, admin, fields, and then add a new TSX file called error.tsx. And in it, we're going to use client and import from payload our email field error client component. I want this error to tell me exactly what's going on with the field, so I'm also going to import from Payload CMS UI the use field hook. So we can export a const called error and assign the email field error client component and set it equal to our path and open up an arrow function. We'll then use a const to destructure our value property out of the use field hook, and in the use field hook we'll use path, which will receive a path and it'll be non-null. There's another prop we need to grab from the use field hook this time, and that's the show error prop. This will return a Boolean value of whether or not the error should be shown. Once we grab this, we can check if show error and open that up, and when that happens we can return a div that holds a paragraph element that says something like error value is not a valid email address. I get a type error when I type in value here, so again we're expecting a string, so I can cast this as a string. If show error does not exist, we can just return null. We also want to make sure the error message looks like it's not a part of the normal flow of our UI. So let's change the color to red. We'll give the error container div a class name called error and go to our custom.scss and target our error class name and just give it the color red. Now we need to add an email field to our post config. We can do that at the top of our fields array by adding in a new field with the name email with type email, and we're going to add our admin components error, which is going to receive an object with a path, which is going to be source components admin fields error.tsx with error as the export name. So now, as always, we can run payload generate import map, restart our development server, refresh our collection item here. We can see here at the top that our email field still passes validation as a blank field. If we type in a few randomly pressed characters with no @ symbol or top-level domain, we'll see our error pop up using the value of the field. We can then type in something like @gmail.com and that error will go away. Of course, this may not be a real email address, but it does meet the default requirements of the email field. So I'll publish changes and we can see that that updates successfully. The cell custom component renders on the list view of a collection, along with the default props we've been working with. The cell custom component also receives the link and on-click prop. This allows you to wrap the table cell in a link that can go to another part of the site, and the on-click prop will allow you to add custom logic to what happens when you click on the cell. Let's say we want to add a link to the email field we just created that will allow us to open our default email app when we click on it. To do this, we'll create a new TSX file in our components admin fields directory that we'll call cell.tsx. We'll be using values that show up on the client side, so we're going to need to use our use client directive at the top of our file here. And we'll also need to import type default cell component props from payload. We can then export a const called email cell and set it equal to props, which has the type default cell component props, and open an arrow function. In it, we can destructure the cell data constant from props. We can then return an anchor tag with the href of mail to cell data with the text of cell data. Now, if we go back to our post config and in our email field add cell, we can add a new path for source components admin fields cell.tsx email cell and save that, generate our import map, restart our development server, and refresh the page. We can go back to our blog posts, and we see here that we are now able to click on the email field and it'll say send email to that email address at the bottom of our screen. Now, what if we want to add an icon to a cell? For example, I want to include an icon to our post title depending on if it's published or in draft mode. So I'll put our first blog post here into draft mode by unpublishing it and go back to our list view here. We'll need to rebuild some of the functionality of the cell, but this is fairly simple to do. Let's first go back to our cell.tsx file and export a const called title cell, and we're going to set this equal to props default cell component props. We're then going to destructure the props for cell data, row data, and collection slug, and this will be set equal to props. We'll then also get our status and our ID from our row data. And lastly, we're going to import our get server-side URL and then add the admin string to the end of it there. We'll then create two new constants, one for our unpublished icon and one for our published icon, and paste them here. These are both from Lucid's icon library. And then we're going to create a new const called icon to return based on our status. If it's published, we'll return the published icon. Otherwise, it'll be unpublished. This is just to make our code look a little bit cleaner. We'll then return a div of the icon with a link to our URL and concatenate our collections and then our collection slug, and then finally the ID of our object. We'll then close the link and we will again use cell data. Now we can go back to our post config, and underneath our title, we can add under the description cell custom component, and then we're going to pass in the path, which is going to be source components admin fields cell.tsx, and then we're going to have title cell be the export name. We'll generate our import map, run the development server, and refresh our page. Here now we can see that we have a published icon and a draft icon. If I want to change this icon, I can publish the post and we can see that it changes. And if we wanted this one to be unpublished or in draft mode, we can do that too. As you can see, there's a lot you're able to edit and replace to make the Payload CMS admin UI your own. Hopefully this video has given you some ideas on how you can customize your own project. I hope to come back to discuss how you can edit your filter and diff components as well. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content around Payload CMS, nextjs, and more. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.